Hello everybody and welcome back to my flipped English class. Today's lesson is talking about the second conditional. Now we have zero first conditionals also. Conditionals have an if clause, that is the condition, and they have a result clause or a main clause, and that is the result. When it rains, things get wet. When it rains, it'll get wet. When it rains, things will get wet. That's the first condition. It has a will. Zero, when it rains, things get wet. And in this case, we have a simple present grammar, simple present grammar. Not always the case. Sometimes we can say when it's raining, but usually that's wrong. So in my mind, there are other examples, but I usually focus on the simple present. When it rains, things get wet. When it doesn't rain, things don't get wet. But in the first condition, we have the simple present when it rains, but then we have a will or verb root combination. It will get wet, or things will get wet. It has no condition. There's no condition. That means it's the zero condition. That means when something happens, something else always happens. You don't need a condition. Water boils when it reaches 100 degrees Celsius. Okay, here's the first simple present. Here's the second simple present. And we're using the word when, not if. Water boils if it reaches. It's the same. If you heat water, it boils. Okay, so it's, again, heat is the simple present, boils is the simple present. If you freeze it, it turns to ice. Turns is the simple present. Freeze is the simple present. When you don't refrigerate food, don't say refrigerate is a verb, it perishes, it goes bad, it rots. Your food rots. That's a verb. It's a simple present. When people eat too much, they get fat. When you mix red and yellow, you get orange. One mistake is people will use the will, and they don't understand that's the first condition. And it is a conditional situation at that point. Here's some examples. If it rains, I'll pick you up from school. If it doesn't rain, I won't pick you up from school. You can walk. If you study more, your English will get better. If they don't arrive soon, we'll leave without them. If they're late, I'll be angry. If they offer a good price, we'll buy it. If I don't go to bed early, I won't be able to get up. If he's sleeping, he won't wake up in the morning. And we have the negative too. If it rains, things get wet. If it doesn't rain, things don't get wet. If it rains, it'll get wet. If it doesn't rain, it won't get wet. But what about the second condition? Where's the second condition fall into this? It sounds like this. If it rained, it would get wet. Let's repeat. If it rained, it'd get wet. If it rained, it'd get wet. One more time. If it rained, it'd get wet. The negative. If it didn't rain, it wouldn't get wet. Again, if it didn't rain, it wouldn't get wet. That's the second condition. So when you compare the first and the second condition together, you might notice that you have one that looks a little different. Which one's the past? It's my trick question, because everybody always says the second condition is the past because they see the past verb. But the truth is, neither of these forms, the first and the second, neither are the past. It's not the past. It's now and the future. The past is the third condition. It's if it had rained, it would have got wet. Or if it hadn't rained, it wouldn't have got wet. That's the third condition, and that's the past. Changing the past is impossible. It's always impossible. Let's look at this. Simple past and would plus verb root. Let's repeat it again. If it rained, it'd get wet. If it rained, you'd get wet. If it didn't rain, it wouldn't get wet. If it didn't rain, you wouldn't get wet. This is the second condition, and it's very, very useful in English. So the first and the second condition are both the future, now or in the future. If it rains, it'll get wet. If it rained, it would get wet. If it doesn't rain, it won't get wet. If it didn't rain, it wouldn't get wet. My next question for you is, what's the difference between the first and the second condition? The answer lies in what the person making the statement is actually thinking. It depends on what the person making the statement is thinking. If the statement the person is making, if the person thinks that the statement he's making is realistic, then he uses the first condition. And if he's making a hypothetical statement, then it's more of the second condition. If it rains, it'll get wet. That's the first condition. The person who says this In his mind, there's not a chance that it's going to be a sunny day. In his mind, he believes that it's going to be a cloudy day and possibly start to rain. It's probable even. It's not raining now. Is it raining now? No, it isn't. But in his mind, the probability is high. It's a possible situation. It's not raining, but the speaker thinks it's probable or possible. That's a realistic situation in his mind. First condition situations are possible and probable. Rain is a realistic situation. Rain is never impossible. But sometimes we do believe it's improbable. For example, if there's a sun in the sky and no clouds. Do you believe it will rain soon? I don't. Neither do I. But if it rained, you'd get wet. In this case, it's a hypothetical situation. And being a hypothetical situation, when we say, if it rained, it'd get wet, we use a simple past. But we use a would result clause. And in this case, in my mind, when I say this, it's improbable. Yes, the situation is improbable. The situation happening, rain, is improbable, and it's possibly impossible. In this case, it's not impossible because rain is never impossible, but there are many situations that are impossible. For example, man having a baby. Can a man have a baby? No. However, if I could have a baby, I would name him David, like me. So, real situations and hypothetical situations need different types of grammar. In the real situation, the speaker thinks the situation is possible or probable. In the hypothetical situation, the speaker thinks the situation is impossible or improbable. One example for the real, if it rains, I'll pick you up from school. If it doesn't rain, I won't. You can walk. Put your bike away. If it rains, it will get rusty. There's also other ways to say it. If there's rain, your bike will get wet. If there isn't rain, your bike won't get wet. You can say if it rains, if it doesn't rain. You can say if there's rain, if there isn't rain. There's many ways to put this together. If there were rain, that's the second condition. If there were rain, your bicycle would get wet. If there weren't rain, your plants wouldn't get wet. There are some exceptions to this rule. Because when we use when in the first condition, it implies that eventually this will happen, when. But when we have the second condition, we don't believe it will happen, so we don't imply it. If you use when here, then you're going to change the meaning. If you try to use when in the second condition, when it rained we would get wet, now it sounds like a story about the past. So you're changing the grammar from the second condition to the simple past. When I was young during summer, we'd stay out all day. We'd never go home. That's talking about the past. And it's possible to use would instead of the simple past. But, of course, when we have our result, you would get wet. That's not the past. That's the future. Exception number 2. Let's look at this scenario. What would you like to do with your life? I always ask my students this question. And I use something like, would you like to? This is not, it says would, right? But it's not would plus a verb. It's would plus you like, or you. If I could do anything, I'd like to travel around the world. That's actually wrong. Please don't say, if I could do anything. If you have an if clause, don't use I would like to. Because what would you like to do is like, what do you want to do? It's polite English. What would you like? We use polite English in many different situations that are hospitable. In the restaurant, you might ask, what would you like to eat? We could also say, where would you like to go? Or what would you like to do? These are very polite ways of asking the questions. What would you like to eat? And what do you want to eat is the same. Where do you want to go is just like where would you like to go? And what do you want to do? These questions are not conditional. It's very polite to use would like. And it's simple present, it's very direct. So sometimes we think it's impolite. What do you want? 要什么? In Chinese, I think sometimes that sounds very impolite. So I would use in English, what would you like? Instead of what do you want? But in these conditions, if I could do anything, I'd like to travel around the world. 真的不行, it's not correct. If I could do anything, I'd love to travel. I'd want to travel. I'd need to travel. Those are all good without the if clause. If you can take this away, you can say to somebody, hey, guess what? I'd like to travel around the world. But because we don't have the condition, there's no problem. So when you see the like to, or the want to, or the need to, remember that it's the verb that follows it that's the main verb. We don't want to change the meaning. This changes the meaning slightly into a request. Instead of changing it to a request, you should focus on the second condition. Take away the like to and just use the main verb. If I could do anything, I'd travel around the world. Now that's the second condition. Another example of a problem students have is when they say, I won't do that. We usually wouldn't talk about won't in something we wouldn't do. Usually when there's something we don't do, doing it is a hypothetical situation for us. So don't say, I won't do that. Instead, change it to, I wouldn't do that. And one more thing, and our presentation's almost over. We also can say, if I could do anything, I would travel around the world. That's using would. And when we use that modal, that's one way to do it. We also have other modals we can use. For example, when we say would, we're 100% sure of the result. That means that if I could do anything, I'm 100% sure I would travel around the world. When we use the next could, that means the result is possible. So if I were rich, I could travel around the world. That's possible. That means traveling is a possibility. It's one possible option. So the result is a possible option or result. And the last one is might. If I could do anything, I might travel around the world. If I were rich, I might travel around the world. So if you use that, then you're saying it may happen. When we say would or could or might, the speaker has a different idea in his head. Would, it's 100% sure of the result. For could, it's possible, and for might, it's maybe. It might happen. And what about the negatives? Wouldn't, couldn't, might not. We don't say mightn't. We say might not. And the truth is that person would be sure of the result 100% not happening. And couldn't means it's the impossible result, and might not means the result might not happen. And that is the end of my presentation about the second condition. Next time we'll talk about the third condition, but this week we'll take a quiz on the second condition. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to seeing you in class. Bye-bye.